In this class, we will be discussing regarding the language and literature during the period of Sultanate, though we will be keeping aside the literary creations of Persian and Arabic. It is a huge corpus, and we will be concentrating mainly on the Indic languages and dividing our discussion first focusing on the Sanskrit and the literary creations of Sanskrit, and in the second half we will be discussing regarding the regional languages, development and efflorescence of the languages of the regional variety. Though it was no more the language of the dominating ruling class, it was no more the language of the kings, still we have a huge amount of literature being created in Sanskrit. And here we find that in contrast to the earlier period, it was Kashmir which was dominating the literary scene of Sanskrit. But in this period we find it is mainly in south and followed by Bengal and the other regions like Mithila and the western India, which dominated the literary creations of Sanskrit. The royal lineages, royal families, like in south, first the Kakatiyas, then after the demise of the Kakatiyas, the Vijayanagara Empire, they were actively promoting Sanskrit language. Many of the political personages, the kings, they were themselves important literary figures, like for instance Prataprudra Dev of Kakatiya dynasty. Then we have Praudha Devaraya or the Devaraya II, and followed by Krishna Devaraya himself, who took active participation in the creation of the Sanskrit compositions, and they had patronized in a big way the language creation, literary creations in their regions. Naturally, it is South India which predominated the literary world, literary creation, eclipsing the earlier predominant position of Kashmir, followed by very important literary creations from Bengal, followed by Mithila, and then the western India. This was the overall situation of the Sanskrit literary world. We have the historical kavyas being created. For instance, Gadya Karnamritam, created by Sakalavidya Chakravarti, who was patronized by the Hoysala king, 3rd Ballal. Then we have Vidyaranya, who was versatile genius, being responsible for the establishment of the Vijayanagara kingdom. Then Madhavacharya of south. Then Kavi Sharbabhauma from south again donned the mantle of Bana himself. So there were a galaxy of literary figures in south. Taking a cue from the earlier Rajatarangini, we have the next phase of Rajatarangini being created in the period of Jainul Abidin, who was ruling in Kashmir in the 15th century. We have creations of the second Rajatarangini phase, then by Yona Raja. He couldn't complete it up to Jainul Abidin, so his disciple took up the third Rajatarangini being created, and political history of Kashmir was taken up to the annexation of Akbar when he occupied Kashmir. This was taken up by a new creation which was known as Rajavali Pataka. different places we find this Champu Kavya being created, like in Vijayanagara, the Vijayanagara king Devaraya II. We have his marriage being described in this Champu format, and there the prabandhas were also there, a huge amount of prabandhas being created. And also we find another segment, the Sandesa sort of creation, where the separated lover is being sending message to the heroine, or vice versa, through some messenger. This was another very important segment of the literary creations in this period. Apart from this, grammatical works were continued, though mainly keeping Panini as their model. And a huge literature was being created as the commentaries on Dharma Shastra and the legal texts. And here Bengal was taking the lead. In the case of Mithila, it is Chandeshwar who wrote the Vivada Ratnakara, and along with Vivada Chintamani being created by Vachashpati Mishra, this Vivada Chintamani and Vivada Ratnakar, this was considered to be the finest exposition of the legal texts in Mithila. In Bengal also, we find that apart from Jimudbahan, actually he was the predecessor, there were other two of the triumvirate who dominated the legal literature, and there Shulapani and Raghunandan were of this period. And it is said that Raghunandan, he was a contemporary of Chaitanya Dev himself. He was so proficient in the Sriti Shastras that he was renamed as Smarta Bhattacharya, or just Smarta. And he wrote a finest exposition, finest commentary on Daibhag. Taking all these things, we can say that though Sanskrit was no more the language of the ruler, barring a few places, South became the major focus of the Sanskrit literary creations. But apart from this, we also should keep in mind that within Delhi, we have the famous Palambauli inscription, which was inscribed during the period of Balban. So Sanskrit inscriptions were being created even within the Delhi Sultanate itself. Apart from this, all over India we find important literary creations being created in the Sanskrit language and literature.
So why is it that this period has such a lot of development in the regional language?
This was not a very abrupt thing. This is the first thing that you should remember. Long-term development was going on with a very important phonetic innovation involved in it. The main development was from, say, Sanskrit through Prakrit, then the regional adaptations, Apabhransha, and in this period we find the full-fledged development of Bhasha language. For instance, Tapta being heated in Sanskrit, it becomes in Prakrit Tatta, and then in the Apabhransha and in the final Bhasha phase it becomes Tata. What is happening? Number one, in the Sanskrit, you can say the doubling of the letters, it is being doubled in the consonant, and then in the final development phase, one of the consonant is being dropped, which is then balanced by the elongation of the vowel. So this type of developments were taking place. There we find that from Prakrit, the regional level Prakrits were being developed, from which we find the development of the Apabhrangsha. How? In the eastern part of India, Bengal, parts of Bihar, in Assam, we have the Magadhi dialect, Prakrit. Magadhi, Prakrit, and then the Magadhi Apabhrangsha. In the central part, we have the Ardha Magadhi adaptation, Prakrit. In the northern part, it is Khasa in the Himalayan territory. In the Maharashtra, it is the Maharashtrian type of Prakrit and then the Apabhrangsha thing. In western UP region, we have Shaurasheni dialect, which was being continued. From this, we have the development of Chhattisgarhi, Awadhi, to some extent the Kanauji dialect also developed. So, we have in this period the development, efflorescence of the language. What are the developments that we find? The phonetic development and the linguistic development that I have just given you the very brief idea. The other factors are, in this period we find the development of bhakti. Elements of bhakti were already there. In South it started. But in this period, that is from the 11th century onwards, we find that the development of bhakti slowly penetrating the different parts of northern India. And in this period, from 13th, 14th century onwards, we find this development of bhakti being reflected in language. For instance, Bhojpuri, which was a distinct language in this period, we have the creations of Kabir, some of his creations, which we find in the composition known as Bijak, which means seeds, seeds of his thought. There, the earliest stratum comprises of Bhojpuri creations. Later, it becomes a kind of composite language where Awadhi, Shaurasheni, they are also being mixed and a composite language comes up. What is his message? He is denigrating the Brahminic religion and trying to democratize the whole religion, where there will be no intermediary between the God and the follower. Not only that, this message of unbounded love, this was being preached in the local language. And we have literary creations then taking place in these languages. So, religious movement also helped in the development of the regional languages. There are innumerable number of instances. I will give you some of the instance or examples. In the particular region of Vrindavan and Mathura, there, from the inspiration derived from Telugu Brahmin, Vallabhacharya, who lauded Krishna and his dalliances in and around Vrindavan and Mathura, a group of poets started their literary creations, and the best exponent is Suradas and his Sur Saravali. This gives a distinct shape to the regional language. In this manner, we find that the religious movement helping the development of regional languages. Another very important example is the case of Nanak. He was from the eastern Punjab region, where a distinct dialect had already developed. When he was narrating his ideas based on ideas which is akin to the ideas being preached by Kabir, he was taking the help of the local language. And there, his biography and the writings, which we know as the Adi Granth, which was composed later in the 17th century under the leadership of Guru Arjan, this shows a distinct stage in the development of the language in this region. In Bengal, the language was developing from, say, 11th century onwards. The earliest strata we find in the writings of some Buddhist monks who had a distinct idea different from the earlier Buddhist monks, which is generally known as the easier vehicle, Sahaj Yan. There, they were creating the Charyapad. It is in a kind of opaque language. They were preaching their ideas. After that, in this period, in the 13th century, we find development taking distinct shape. Number one, Chaitanya emerges as a very important personage, and his ideas, his movement, this was creating ripples. So when Chaitanya came up, the reverberations of his movement, he was a magnetic personality, not only in Bengal, but it had serious repercussions in Odisha also. This had effects on literary creations, even in aspects of grammatical compositions also. Appearance of Chaitanya had some impact. And obviously, 15th century can be considered to be a very important phase in the history of Bengal, particularly in the context of language and literature, because it was not just appearance of Chaitanya, obviously it was a watershed in the history of Bengal, but also the sultans, particularly Hussain Shahi dynasty, had given patronage, enormous amount of patronage to the local language and literature. Two of the close confidants of Hussain Shah himself, Roop and Sanatan, they became followers of Chaitanya, later settled in Vrindavan to give a distinct shape to the Vaishnavite church in Vrindavan, and also they were important literary figures themselves. One of the anthologies, Padavali, was created by Roop, and they had their own ideas about grammatical compositions as well as the philosophical compositions. So, from these aspects, 15th century can be considered to be a very important phase in the history of Bengal's literature. Not only this, just before this, but continued till the late 17th century, we have Mangal Kavyas. Be it the story of Behula or Lakshmendra, who was afflicted by the snake goddess Manasha, and the death-defying love towards her husband of Behula, which ultimately brings him back to life. This has been narrated in the context of Manasha Mangal. Then we have Chandi Mangal. Then we have Dharma Mangal. With these kind of literatures, the autochthonous deities, gods and goddesses, they were being incorporated within the Brahminical pantheon, and obviously this had repercussions in the context of language and literature. Not only this, lyrical compositions. Say for instance, you are familiar with the name of Chandidas. There was one Bodu Chandidas or Ananta Bodu Chandidas who composed the Sri Krishna Kirtan. Then there were Dija Chandidas and Dina Chandidas who composed which poem. That is a matter of debate. But this is true that the lyrical quality of the compositions, it was no doubt, or it brought Bengali language to its maturity. And obviously, after that, the effect of Chaitanya and his followers on the Bengali language, it had tremendous impact. Not only in Bengal, the same thing was happening in Odia also, which had a long tradition. From 12th century onwards, we find Madalapanji in the Jagannath temple. This can be considered to be the seed of the development of language. But when Chaitanya came to Puri and stayed there for a long time, he had a group of followers, friends, who had tremendous impact on the development of Oriya language. So, we can say that in the northern region, northern part of India, it was an amalgamation of some phonetic developments, some linguistic developments, which was reinforced by the religious movements. Now, keeping aside north, if we go to south, already the literary traditions were to some extent well established. Tamil language, it had a long history from the earlier part of the Christian era through the Sangam literature. But in this period, we find creation of Sri Villiputturar, who translated Mahabharata in Tamil, almost same in his contribution, and can be compared with the translation of Ramayana by Kamban in the earlier period. What Kamban did to Tamil by translating Ramayana in Tamil, Sri Villiputturar, he did the same thing by translating Mahabharata in Tamil. Also, in this period, we have the creations of, for instance, Arunagiri. Through his Tirupuhal, he propitiates in front of, or this is the creation to commemorate the different achievements of Murugan or Kartikeya in the South Indian form. Then subsequently we find Kachayappa Shivacharya, who composed the Kanda Puranam, which also was for Murugan. With all these compositions, the development of Tamil was going on. In the context of Telugu, we find again Naranappa translating Mahabharata. Either Mahabharata or Ramayana, translating these two pan-Indian works in the typical format of the language and the tenor of a locality, it becomes the distinct feature for the development of regional languages. Same thing is happening in Kannada also. There again a religious movement is playing a very important role. Rise of the Veerashaiva movement. This is having a tremendous impact on the development of both the Kannada language as well as in the context of Telugu language. In South, Malayalam, the word comes from Malai. Malai means hill region. Now, this language and the way of life of the hill people in the southernmost part, it becomes a distinct literary creation in the 15th century with again the translation of Ramayana and Mahabharata. With this, we find even in the southern part of India, in the peninsular India, where already there were some very distinct literary traditions and creations, there also a new language is coming up with its full trappings in this period. So, in this period can be considered to be a very important period for the development of the regional languages both in the northern India and in southern India. I will end with just a note that the development that we were tracing, it is still going on. The dialect which was prevalent in and around Delhi, which was known as Khari Boli, in which actually Amir Khusru, the noted Persian poet, composed some of his writings. In the last 200 years, it has become a kind of hegemonic proportion, and as a result, we find that the distinct literary languages, for instance, Bhojpuri, then Maithili even, Awadhi, Kanauji, all these have come under the rubric of just a dialect of Hindi, which was not the case in our period, the period that we are discussing. In this period, in the 13th to 16th century, they all were distinct languages, but now they have just become a dialect of Hindi. So the development of language it goes on because of many factors. So with this we end. To conclude, this period that we discussed, it saw very important changes and development in the growth of regional languages.